Okay, the final announcement. What's it gonna be? Is it actually Xenoblade 3? Wait a minute, I think it's actually Xenoblade 3. Oh my god, it's Xenoblade 3! It's Xenoblade 3!
Tell me!
It's Xenoblade 3!
You to sign?
Game of the year. This is the game of the year! This is the game of the year! What? It's Xenoblade 3! It's Xenoblade 3! It's Xenoblade 3! Xenoblade 3! Ah! Yes! Yes! Ah! As you could probably tell by the clips I just showed you, I kinda like this series. The first game is my favorite of all time, and the second is not far behind. In fact, Why You Should Care as a whole wouldn't even exist if it wasn't for the series. When Xenoblade Definitive Edition was first announced at the end of the 2019 September Direct, I was actually fairly disappointed, as it was a remaster of a game I wasn't all that interested in. After getting it though, it ended up becoming my favorite game of all time, and now has basically ruined, changed my life. At this point, I own and have played every single Xenoblade game, not the entire Xeno series, because but overall, the games I have played are some of my favorites of all time. Whether you're interested in playing the series or not, hopefully you will watch this video and learn why it's pretty cool. And even if you still aren't interested in the series, I hope you can at least appreciate or respect its existence, so the next time you see it in a direct, you won't feel as disappointed. Side note, I will not be talking about Xenoblade X on the Wii U, because it's the Wii U, and because it does not have as much to do with the main trilogy of games, and it's not worth talking about in this video, though it is still a really good game and I will probably make a video on it eventually. Our story starts with a man named Tetsuya Takahashi, a former Falcom employee who worked at Squaresoft and worked on some of the Super Nintendo Final Fantasy titles. He eventually started work on his own game, which has its own whole development story, but I won't get into that here, called Xenogears. The game was a critical and commercial success, however, his initial vision was heavily compromised by the inexperience of the team and the technical limitations of the time. After releasing Xenogears, Takahashi was not a fan of the direction that Square was going in, so he left the company and co-founded his own, which was named Monolith Soft. Monolith Soft teamed up with Namco to release a bunch of games, including Namco Cross Capcom, Baten Kaitos, and of course, Xenosaga. Xenosaga was a spiritual successor to Xenogears that also has its own whole history, but long story short, it didn't do that well commercially. Then, in 2007, Monolith Soft was purchased by Nintendo, who promised to offer them creative freedom to create the projects they wanted, as long as they were only released on Nintendo consoles. Monolith Soft created many projects on Nintendo, including a Japan-exclusive RPG called Somabringer for the DS, and Disaster Day of Crisis for the Wii, which was only released in Japan, Europe, and Australia. Not North America though, because Reggie hated the game, which... Wow, okay, yeah, you're doing a really good job of selling that game, Mr. Reggie. One of their most notable contributions to Nintendo is their impressive amount of support work done with many of Nintendo's first-party games. Monolith Soft has helped with the development of Super Smash Bros. Brawl, The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, Animal Crossing New Leaf, Pikmin 3, The Legend of Zelda Link Between Worlds, Splatoon, Animal Crossing Happy Home Designer, Splatoon 2, Animal Crossing New Horizons, and most notably, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and most likely the untitled sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and Splatoon 3. Of course though, the main thing they have done at Nintendo is create the series we all know and hopefully love, Xenoblade, which was renamed to Xenoblade Chronicles in the West for some reason. The first game was initially created as a project to help boost the team's morale after the failure of the Xenosaga trilogy. It wasn't even supposed to be a series, and while I'll avoid spoilers, the ending does not really set up for any kind of sequel or future title. In fact, the game wasn't even supposed to be a Xeno game, as it was initially just called Monado Beginning of the World, though Satoru Iwata suggested that they name the game Xenoblade to pay homage to Takahashi's earlier works. The project actually started in 2006, before the release of the Wii, when Takahashi came up with the idea of a game world that consisted of two large titans. And that's not necessarily crucial to know, but I just really want to show off this image because it's super cool, and I feel like a lot of people haven't seen it. So here it is. Like, just look at that. That's sick. Anyway, Xenoblade released in Japan and Europe just fine. However, the game was not released in North America, with Nintendo of America even saying that they had no plans to release it in the region. After a fan campaign called Operation Rainfall, which was made to promote the localization of 3 Wii games in North America, the game was finally released in 2012, exclusively at GameStop, who opened new copies of the game so that they could sell them at prices above MSRP. Yeah, unfortunately Xenoblade 1 was not the biggest success initially, and even sold worse than the first Xenosaga game. Luckily though, the main protagonist, Shulk, made his way into Super Smash Bros. For the Nintendo Wii U and 3DS, which gave him a huge popularity boost and most likely saved the entire series from falling into obscurity. Then, in the same year, a port for the first game to the new Nintendo 3DS was released, though this was not done by Molotov, it was basically just a remake with no new content. And then, Xenoblade X released on the Wii U, but again, I'll be talking about that in a separate video since it doesn't have much relation to the main Xenoblade games. The next release was Xenoblade 2 on the Nintendo Switch. Now, despite what the title suggests, this game is actually more of a spiritual successor to the first game that continues the more narrative-focused structure that was abandoned in X. Xenoblade 2 is controversial, to say the least, with debates over character designs, combat, and story happening basically every month for the last 5 years. But still, the game was well received and to this day is Molotof's best-selling game ever. The game was so successful that it received an expansion pass that it included a huge peak world DLC called Torna that is so big it sold as its own game that could be purchased separately. Then, a few years later, Molotov announced Xenoblade Definitive Edition, a remaster/remake of the original Wii game that gives it a much needed upgrade. I'll go into more details later, but one thing that's important to note is that this game came bundled with a short epilogue that gives a better ending to a certain character and teases a little bit for the future of the franchise. The next year also saw the reveal and release of Pyra and Mythra in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, who I think are top tiers? I honestly don't know, I haven't played this game in forever. And that brings us to where we are now with the announcement of Xenoblade 3, planned for release in September of this year. Oh wait, what? It's not coming out in September? It's coming out on July 29th now? Okay, well then. Xenoblade 3 is planned for release on July 29th later this year. They just pushed it 2 months forward. Well, I guess that just shows how good Molotov is at developing games. Details are still pretty vague, but this game is shaping up to be one of the best entries in the series, maybe even the best if Molotov manages to do everything right this time. But now that we've talked about the history, let's go into a little more depth on the games and talk about some of the things that make them so great. Remember how I mentioned that Molotov helped with Breath of the Wild's development? Well, in case you were wondering why they were chosen specifically to help with the open world, allow me to just show you this. Yeah, but it's not just the impressive environments. The games also feature incredible world building. The first game takes place on two great titans, the Bionis and Mechonis. The two titans were at war with each other until they were eventually locked into a dormant state for the rest of time. And so, the entire interconnected world of the game takes place on these two titans, and you get to explore a ton of different areas. Just on the Bionis, you got Satorl Marsh, a swamp area that doesn't look too great in the day, but hides a true beauty at night. Frontier Village, which is a big tree that is the home to a bunch of cute little creatures called Nopons. Machna Forest is a huge forest with lush greenery and a beautiful waterfall. Alchemont is the imperial capital of the Bionis, which contains the prestigious Hayatia race. Colony 6 is an area that has been destroyed by the ongoing war, so you collect materials to rebuild the area, and etc. Every area contains a day and night version that runs on an in-game clock, and sometimes, like with Satorl Marsh and Black Mountain, the two can look very different. It's also worth exploring these areas beyond the main set path to find some secret areas that could give you some really cool viewpoints and fight tougher unique monsters. The only problem is that some of these areas, like Gower Plains, are super big and the player lacks the necessary movement abilities to compensate for that, but they still look very impressive, especially considering this game was originally released on the Wii. The second game takes place in the separate world of Allrest. The people live on Titans again, but instead, in this game, the Titans are living creatures that actually contribute to the ecosystem of the world. This game isn't as interconnected as the first game, with fast travel being necessary to get between Titans, but the areas are much bigger and more detailed thanks to the better hardware. Like the first game, this also contains an in-game clock, secret areas, and unique monsters, though the more complicated maps can sometimes make it more frustrating to explore, and the navigation system is far worse. Seriously, what is this? Still though, Xenoblade 2 deserves a lot of credit for its incredible looking worlds that are on par with and even surpass those of the first game. One thing is for certain though, no matter which Xenoblade game you play, you should be prepared to tackle a lot, and I mean a lot, of side quests. The first Xenoblade game has over 400 side quests, Future Connected has 41, Xenoblade 2 has 150, Torna has 58, and Xenoblade 3 will probably have a few trillion. In no game are you expected to even try to complete them all, but it does mean that there's a lot of extra content to get to aside from the incredible main stories. Admittedly though, only Future Connected and Torna have actually decent side quests. Ones are way too short, and it's very hard to tell which side quests are the basic fetch quests and which are actual story quests, and 2s are way too long and generally uninteresting, with many being very vague about their objectives. I will warn you though, that Torna has 2 moments in which you are blocked for progressing if you haven't done a certain number of side quests. For people like me that do most of them anyway, it isn't really a big issue, but for those that don't like them, it's going to be an unfortunate obstacle. In general though, you will notice that Microsoft loves to put a lot of detail and care into their worlds. It doesn't matter which game you're playing, the games always deliver on setting and environments, and Xenoblade 3 is looking to be no exception. I've always struggled to decide what was my absolute favorite part about these games, but the world is definitely a strong contender. In terms of story and characters, the Xenoblade games are really good. There's a reason there are so many Xenoblade profile pictures on social media. I have to be very vague here, because some of these games have major spoilers as early as 5 hours in, but no matter which Xenoblade game you are playing, you are sure to experience a fantastic narrative. Xenoblade 1 is a very war-focused story of man vs machine, Bios vs Mechanis, Hobbs vs Mechon, etc. This game contains the legendary Monado sword, and as you play it, you uncover the secrets and mysteries surrounding this seemingly simple blade. This premise sounds pretty basic, and at first it is, but as you play through the game, things get a lot more complicated, and the game constantly makes you rethink everything you thought you knew previously. Seriously, each plot twist just gets followed by another, even bigger plot twist, and while many of them have really good foreshadowing, a lot of them are still huge surprises. I generally recommend that you do whatever you can to avoid spoilers for all of these games for the absolute best experience. Xenoblade 2 takes place in a different universe, without Homs, the Bios Mechanis, and even the Monado. Instead, the world is composed of drivers, which are either humans of different races or Napon, blades, and titans. The game also contains a war, though it's far from the main purpose of the story. Instead, the game is all about helping a mysterious blade named Pyra reach Elysium, a mysterious land from a past in which all lived in harmony with their creator, the architect. This game sets up a lot of mysteries like the first game, and while it's not as heavy on the plot twist, there are still some genuinely surprising moments that really change up the story. The only issue with the second game is that it starts off a bit slow, but once you get into the second half, and especially the last few chapters, it honestly becomes on par with, and maybe even surpasses the heights of the first game. And I haven't even talked about the characters. Shulk, Melia, Dubman, Ricky, Mithra, Jin, Laura, even Rex are some of my personal favorites, but in all honesty, there are only a few genuinely bad characters in this series, and most of them aren't even that important anyway. Another key element to most Xenoblade games is heart-to-hearts in 1 and 2 and quiet moments in Future Connected. These moments really focus in on a few characters and their interactions and are generally pretty awesome. They are even fully voice acted in 2 and Future Connected. Unfortunately, one issue is that in Xenoblade 1, the heart-to-hearts have very strict requirements, with most people going through the whole game only seeing a few. But still, they are pretty neat and there are a lot of memorable moments that come from them. So if you have the time, I would definitely recommend trying to get them in the post-game. And if you're wondering about Torna, that game doesn't have heart-to-hearts, but instead uses the side quests and fireplace shots for the character moments, so it's really not a big deal. Oh, and I haven't even mentioned the voice acting for these games. While Xenoblade 2's dub is a little controversial, the first game has one of the greatest dubs I've ever seen in a video game. Like, seriously, just look at this.
Its tentacles could come out from under the ground at any second. One false move and you're done for. Wait for my order. Ryan, you got my back?
Of course. Leave it to me.
Talk all you want. Because those words will be your last!
The Monado! Yeah, it's been a while. But you should know by now. The Monado can't stop me!
Shulk!
Hereupon Ricky, bestest!
In terms of story, Xenoblade 3 is looking to have a character-focused narrative with a core party of 6 characters, with even more joining later in the game. It also seems to be going back to a war-based story like Xenoblade 1, but this game splits up the party, with half being from one side and the other half being from the other. There is certainly a lot of potential here with this story, and I am incredibly excited for it. It's also bringing back some story and not story elements from Xenoblade 1 and 2, but for the sake of spoilers, I won't talk about this connection too much. Also, judging from the ESRB rating, it seems like it's going to be pretty serious, and I personally do not know if I am emotionally ready for what is about to happen here. In terms of combat, it tends to vary across the games, but in every game the core fundamentals stay the same. Characters will automatically do their basic attacks, and then they have stronger attacks they can choose from called arts. Chain attacks freeze the gameplay and give the player the choice to make some more strategic decisions. Aggro is a mechanic that makes attacks from the enemy only target one person. And you can topple enemies to temporarily stun them and get an advantage in battle, which depending on the game can also lead into other certain combos. These elements are the base of each game's combat. These elements have been compared to the combat system of an MMORPG, and thus many people refer to the gameplay as a single-player MMO. I've never played an MMO, so I don't really know how true that is, but I'm just going to assume it's correct. Xenoblade 1 admittedly sticks pretty close to these fundamentals, and doesn't do too much to separate itself, but it still has a few distinct elements. It has a scrolling art wheel of 8 arts, plus 1 unique talent art for each character, and its chain attacks are based on these arts. It arguably has the most party variety of any game, with each of the 7 party members having a mechanic unique to them through their skills and talent art. For example, Shulk is the main attacker wielding the iconic and legendary Monado, and he has a talent art that lets him use unique Monado arts that are very strong in certain scenarios. Ryan is a tank that has a talent art that lets him draw a bunch of aggro and tank some of the heavier attacks. Melia fills the support mage class in this game, but all of her support spells can be discharged with her talent art to do some crazy damage over time. This game also has the infamous topple locking technique, which is kind of broken, but it's still fun and satisfying to do and can even lead to some insane stuff like this. Future Connected is basically just Xenoblade 1's combat system, but it replaces chain attacks with new Pawn Spectre attacks. There's not too much strategy here, and they're honestly just not as good as chain attacks, but considering it's just a 10-hour expansion, it's a neat little gimmick to help separate it from the other games. Okay, now on to Xenoblade 2, and it's a lot. If you were confused by my explanation of Xenoblade 1's combat system, then I genuinely feel sorry for you. Okay, it's not really that bad, but Xenoblade 2's gameplay is easily the single most divisive part of any Xenoblade game. This game introduces the controversial blade system, which is based on everyone's favorite gaming mechanic, Random Gacha! It's not the worst thing in the world, and the issue is generally overblown, but it can get pretty grindy to get some of the rarer blades in the game, with the rarest one, Cosmos, having a base pull rate of 0.1%. Once you get into the actual combat though, it is simultaneously both simpler and more confusing than Xenoblade 1's combat. The art wheel is gone, and now each driver can pick one of 3 arts, depending on which of their 3 blades they have active. Sounds simple, right? Then, after using a number of arts, they can use blade specials, which can use the blade combos, and then those blade combos can use in conjunction with driver combos. When you prepare for the first game, become phasing place with block, and then that can be followed with smash. Then after you finish your blade combo, you can summon an orb, and then with those orbs, you can chain attack and break those orbs, and then do bouncing damage. Got all that? Now, while this may sound like a lot, in general, the beginning of the game actually feels slow, due to a lot of small frustrations that add up to a generally less pleasant experience. This is not at all helped by the fact that the tutorials are unanimously agreed upon by everyone to be absolutely terrible. Seriously, if you have any interest in playing this game, I strongly recommend looking at Chunga Conroy's non-spoiler guide that talks about things that are good to know at the beginning of the game. I unfortunately didn't, and just had a worse experience with the game. Even though the combat isn't as fun as first, as you get to the latest post-game, the combat becomes super fun and satisfying, with every mechanic playing into each other in fun ways. I'd argue Xenoblade 2 has one of the best combat systems in the series, once you know what you're doing, only behind its more refined prequel. The elemental affinities, chain attacks, and large number of blades open up a bunch of build possibilities, and while the preparation can be time consuming, it can lead to some insanely satisfying results in the end. Even though I can understand that some people may feel alienated by Xenoblade 2's combat at first, I strongly recommend sticking with it if you can, because I promise it gets better. Much better. Now, in Torna, literally every issue I had with Xenoblade 2 was fixed, and the combat system is better in every way. The issue of initial slowness is fixed by the generally quicker pace of every attack, the cool new vanguarded blade switches that allow you to switch party members mid-combat, and the far better tutorials. While most of this is due to the nature of the game as a shorter expansion to Xenoblade 2, it's still pretty awesome, and the game has my favorite combat system in the entire series. Alright, let's just get the versions out of the way first and foremost, because this is the easy part to explain. Just play them on Switch. Monolith Soft has blessed us with the re-release of Xenoblade 1 on the Switch that is literally called the Definitive Edition, and there is no reason to get any of the other versions because this exists. It has many quality of life features like better quest tracking and UI, it looks and sounds nicer, and it includes the Future Connect expansion, which cannot be played in any other way. If you happen to already own the first game on another console, like the Wii or new 3DS, and haven't played it yet, then it's okay to just play that version. Missing out on Future Connected may be a little bit disappointing, but considering how short it is, it's not that big of a deal. And because that's the only game that has been released on other consoles, as long as you own a Switch, you're set. So if you are interested in Shulk or Pyramithra because of Smash Ultimate, you are perfectly able to play and enjoy the entire series. When you compare this to something like the Trail series, this is also a really great luxury, and it is extremely convenient for people getting into this series. In terms of play order, things get a little bit confusing, but if you don't own any of the games and you just follow this order, you will be fine. First, play Xenoblade 1 via Definitive Edition, Future Connected, Xenoblade 2, Torna, and then finally Xenoblade 3. You do not need to worry about playing Xenoblade X, Xenogears, or Xenosaga if your goal is to just enjoy the Xenoblade storyline and the plot connections in Xenoblade 3. Keep in mind, this play order is very flexible, as only a few of the games are actually connected. There is only one absolute must you need to follow, and two incredibly strong recommendations. Now I will go through each game one by one and explain why I put them in that spot, as well as address any other potential orders to play the games in. Firstly, I strongly encourage you to begin your Xenoblade journey with the first game. As mentioned earlier in the video, this is the basis for which the series combat is built off of, and is generally the easiest game to get into. The tutorials are pretty solid, and you won't need to look up a guide if you just want to roll the credits. Another thing to consider is that some people that played Xenoblade 1 after 2 felt like it was overall a downgrade and the combat was simpler, so that's another reason to consider starting with this game. This is where I started playing the games, and I personally feel like it's still pretty great even after playing the other games, so I don't really agree with this take, but I do want to mention that as a possible thing to consider. Digitally, this game, and all games for that matter, will cost you $60, with occasional sales for $40, though on the eShop this is very rare. Physically, it's $60, but I highly recommend waiting until it's $40, as it very frequently drops to that price at most retailers. Secondly, I recommend playing Future Connected directly after playing Xenoblade 1. This is the one game where there is a strict rule you need to follow, no matter what play order you're doing. Definitive Edition does allow players to play Future Connected without having beaten the main game, but this is strictly for players that had already played the original game before and just want to get straight into the expansion. Like, literally, the first cutscene of this game is the ending to Xenoblade 1, and the story will not make any sense to you if you have not finished that game first. However, it is not necessarily required that you play it immediately after. If you own Xenoblade 2 by the time you finish Xenoblade 1, you are welcome to just immediately hop into that, but in my personal opinion, this is the best time to play Future Connected. Future Connected has two main reasons to play it. The first is that it concludes the character arc of Melia, one of the stronger characters from the main campaign, and the second is that it teases the future of the Xenoblade series, which basically just means Xenoblade 3. If you didn't really care all that much about Melia in the base game and just want to hop into Xenoblade 2 as soon as possible, then you can save this one for right before Xenoblade 3. I wouldn't personally recommend that, as you may forget important Xenoblade 1 story details and will miss certain callbacks, and you will also have to get used to Xenoblade 1's combat system again after playing Xenoblade 2, but it is an option. Again, this game is included with Xenoblade Definitive Edition, so as long as you purchase that, you are all set. Next, this is where I recommend playing Xenoblade 2. Now, Xenoblade 2 is the best-selling game in the series, and the majority of Xenoblade fans started here. Does that necessarily mean you can too? Yeah, you actually can. To clarify, if you don't own any Xenoblade games yet and are just looking for the absolute best game to start with, then you should definitely start with Xenoblade 1. But if you already have Xenoblade 2 because you purchased it a while ago and just didn't play it, or you were able to borrow it from a friend or something, then you might as well just play 2 first and then go back and play 1 later. It's really not that big of a deal. Something's worth mentioning though, if you don't have the fundamentals of Xenoblade 1's combat, Xenoblade 2 will be even harder to understand, as again, the tutorials are really bad. It's not impossible, and if you do some research and watch the Chung and Conroy video, then you'll probably be fine, but still expect to struggle a bit with understanding the combat. I also strongly recommend that no matter which game you play first, you go ahead and finish the other game as well, especially if you are interested in playing Xenoblade 3. I'll go into more depth when I talk about Xenoblade 3, but knowledge of both games' story and combat will definitely help you enjoy that game way more. Xenoblade 2 is $60 digitally and very infrequently goes on sale below that, so you might as well just grab it at that price. Physically, the game has unfortunately gone out of print, so the only way to purchase it is with a used copy, but those are going for well over MSRP. If you're willing to pay the price, then go for it, but overall, digital is the way to go here. Next is Torna the Golden Country, which is where the first strong but not required recommendation comes in. I won't go into too much detail for the sake of spoilers, but to explain it generally, in Xenoblade 2 there is an event referenced multiple times to have taken place 500 years before the main game. Torna just shows the story leading up to that event. Now, naturally, this game does spoil elements of Xenoblade 2, and considering its status as DLC and release date, it is strongly encouraged that you play Torna after. However, the game is also sold separately physically and digitally from the main game for a cheaper price of $40. Does that necessarily mean you could play it before Xenoblade 2? No, you really shouldn't, but there is one very specific case in which you could. As mentioned before, this game contains spoilers for Xenoblade 2, and its target audience is not those that have never played Xenoblade 2 before. While it does contain a new set of tutorials that are actually good, that do explain the combat system again, at the end of the day, it is still based off of Xenoblade 2's combat. In general, it is strongly encouraged that you play this game after finishing Xenoblade 2. The one case in which you could play this game before finishing Xenoblade 2 is if you start playing the game and really don't like it, but still want to give Xenoblade a shot. I personally believe Torna is the far better game, and I do think there will be a small percentage of people that will not enjoy Xenoblade 2, but will enjoy Torna. So consider that as a possibility. Another possibility, which has been suggested by the executive producer of the game, Tetsuya Takahashi, is to play Xenoblade 2 up to the end of Chapter 7, play Torna, and then go back to the main game and finish up with Chapter 8 to the end. This is due to the fact that the game is actually content that was planned to be in the main game between Chapter 7 and 8, but ended up being scrapped and turned into its own DLC. This is obviously very awkward, and I strongly encourage you not to do this, but I will present the option in case you are interested. Now digitally, you can either get the Xenoblade 2 expansion pass for $30, which includes Torna, or you can purchase it on its own for $40. Obviously, it is better to get the game through the expansion pass, but buying it separately will still give you a code for the expansion pass, so you're not losing out on too much. Physically, just don't even bother. This game was given even less print than Xenoblade 2, and thus is easily the rarest of the main Xenoblade games. I mean, just look at these prices. The final game on our list, and the second strong but not required recommendation, is playing Xenoblade 3 last after playing every other game in the series. I won't go into too much detail here, but the trailer, descriptions, and even combat of this game are making it clear that this is going to be a fusion of the worlds of Xenoblade 1 and 2. That being said, Takahashi has basically stated that they also consider new fans while developing the game, so it is 100% going to be possible to enjoy this game's original story without having knowledge of the other games. I don't think that means you should start with Xenoblade 3, but at the very least, if for some reason you don't enjoy 1 and 2, but still think you may enjoy 3, this means you don't have to worry about trudging through those games just to enjoy this game's story. This game will retail for $60 physically and digitally, and I would recommend just purchasing it at that price, as it will probably take at least a year for it to have any notable drops in either format. So to recap, if you don't own any of the Xenoblade games, play Xenoblade 1, Future Connected, 2, Torna, and then 3 in that order and you will be fine. The one rule you must follow is that you cannot play Future Connected before 1, and the 2 rules I strongly recommend you follow are that you play Torna after 2 and 3 after all the other games in the series. So, hopefully you can tell by now that Xenoblade is pretty neat. The series is obviously not going to be for everyone, and I can especially see people getting this game being really excited, but then feeling disappointed by the combat or some other element. But if you do end up playing the series, I hope you find it very enjoyable and are able to appreciate it for how ambitious it is. The series has been incredibly influential on many modern RPGs, and honestly without it, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild may not even be considered as good as it is, since Monolith Soft would have never been chosen to help out with that game. So yeah, whether you are now interested in playing the series or not, I hope at the very least you now know why you should play Breath of the Wild instead of Ryan, what did you do to my script? Anyway, I hope you now know why you should care about Xenoblade. Thank you for watching.